You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Hello, Will.
And hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 227 of the Common Descent Podcast. On this episode, we're discussing Beaks.
Beaks, we're back in the mouthful region to go with all of our other mouth episodes. We've done a bunch. I was looking at them the other day, and I was considering making a playlist out of just our mouth-themed episodes.
Yeah, no, we have done a lot of things about the mouth. There's a lot more to say there than you might think.
There sure, yeah. Teeth, episode 88. Tusks, 107. Saber teeth, 214. Tongues, 192. We got there's a lot of mouth content.
Yeah, very cool. So we will add to that with Beaks, the toothless bird mouths, though there are more than just birds to discuss this episode. So we will be discussing what makes up a beak, how many animals have them, and what are the trends we see in how birds evolve their beaks and why it seems so many animals evolve beaks.
Yeah, it's a very distinctive and very common type of mouth.
Yes. And it has shown up many, many times, so we'll take a dive into all of that. This episode, as all our episodes, was requested, which is why we're discussing it. A bunch of people wanted to hear about beaks. This was requested by Georgiana, Lowelly, Serpentine, Landon, Sarah, Nathan, Milo the Biohazard, Big Boss Man, Z, Love Me, Love My Cats, James, Maui, Aporva, Paul, Luke, and Alice.
That's a lot of people who want to hear about beaks.
Yeah, good choice, everyone. So we will happily discuss that for you.
Indeed.
But before we get into our discussion, some quick announcements. First and foremost, we have a Patreon.
Still do.
And our Patreon helps keep this podcast running from top to bottom, allows us to do all the cool things we do. And if you sign up on Patreon, you get extra goodies, extra audio from us, bonus episodes, the ability to submit patron questions, and mailed in goodies all at certain levels. And you can get your name shouted out here on the podcast as a thank you. So this episode, we'd like to thank Steven as one of our newest patrons.
Thanks, Stephen, and welcome to the Patreon. A huge thanks to all of the people who support us on Patreon. We love engaging with our patrons. We love creating bonus content and live streams and stuff. And the support is both financially and emotionally very handy.
It's awesome. So thank you all. And speaking of getting to interact with our listeners, we have a cool opportunity to get to hang out with some of you next month, which is our next museum meetup.
Yeah, we are going to be down in Atlanta, Georgia. We frequent Atlanta because we go there for Dragon Con. This time, we're going to be going down there to do a meetup at the Fernbank Museum. October 18th, that's a Saturday, at 1 p.m., Will and I will both be there. If you come by, we'll be in the lobby, I guess, someplace where people will be able to find us. And then we'll hang around and check out the museum together.
It will be a ton of fun. So if you're in the area and you're able to come hang out, join us and we'll just get to enjoy the museum together and have a nice day. Speaking of next month, October is spooky season. And this episode's coming out right before the first weekend of Spooky. So we'll be back with our Spookulative Evolution. And once again, this year, it is Monsters of Nintendo. So you can expect an episode every Saturday. And then we'll have one extra one in November for QD. And then the Spooky live stream.
It's spooky season, one of the best times of the year.
It's so
As
good.
always. Check out the episodes. Join us on the Discord where there will surely be lots of spooky and speculative evolution discussion going on. Very excited.
Yes.
Speaking of special series and things, our sister podcast, our descendant, Leave It to Us, just recently wrapped up season 1 of their show. 12 episodes plus 12 bonus episodes on the Patreon, hosted by Nora and Allie. all about plants and plant evolution and stuff. The last episode of the season was the geologic timescale according to plants, where Allie got to explain her take on how the geologic timescale might look if it were based on plants instead of animals. Super fun stuff. Season 1 is just about done, although patrons have the opportunity to submit questions for the mailbag episode that will be coming out in November. And then it's going to be planning time for Season 2, which will come out next year. So if you haven't checked out Leave It to Us yet, go check it out. Get it wherever you get our podcast. It's tons of fun. If you aren't supporting them on Patreon, on the Leave It to Us Patreon, and you're able to do so, please consider doing so. There's bonus content, and there's going to be some more special in between seasons stuff. And then stay tuned next year for Season 2 when the show returns.
Excellent. It's so exciting that the first season is like complete, and that's awesome.
Very good stuff. Also, one last thing to note, over on our Discord, we have recently surpassed 1,000 members.
Yes! We have 1,000 Discordians.
The Discord has been really active, especially these last several months. Lots of conversations going on about science news and speculative evolution and plants. There's a whole Leave It to Us section of the Discord. It's super cool. We meant to announce the 1,000 members last episode and we forgot. So now we are a little bit past 1,000, but our community is huge.
It's so cool, and it's such a fun community. So if you're wanting to join in on extra Common Descent discussion or just find a community of like-minded people, they're really cool on there, and you would be welcome. So give it a look-see if you're at all interested. Links down in the descriptions. With that, we will wrap up the announcements, and we can move on to our first official section, the news. Every episode, we like to gather up some recent scientific news articles based on evolution, fossil record, earth science, things that we're interested in and to keep us all up to date on what's going on. David, what's your news?
I have news about life on Mars.
All right, I'm hooked. Tell me more.
Stay tuned. This has been making the rounds. This has been making a lot of headlines. The short version is we have what might be the most promising indications of potential signs of life on Mars. This is research published in Nature by Joel Hurowitz et al. And in the blog post, we'll put a link to an article from Thomson Reuters in CBC. So, when we are looking for evidence of life on Mars, what we're looking for are biosignatures. These are the same sorts of things that we're using to study the earliest life on Earth before we have actual fossil evidence, or in cases where we have found direct fossil evidence, we're looking for chemical signatures, molecules or chemical compounds that show evidence of the presence of life processes. This is what the rovers on Mars have been doing basically ever since we confirmed that Mars used to have bodies of water. This is what this has been the next step, is can we find any clues to past life activity? This new evidence comes from the Perseverance rover, which has been up there for a few years. Perseverance landed in 2021, has been exploring rocks in and around an area called the Jezero Crater. In this study, researchers and the robot, our robotic researcher, collected samples from a valley on the side of the crater that includes rocks of what is called the Bright Angel Formation, which is that rock layer up there. Mudstones and conglomerates make up this formation, left behind by a lake fed by a river. So you've got both high energy and low energy deposits. It's over 3 billion years old, as many of the rock layers that we study on Mars are extraordinarily ancient. These particular rocks are of interest because they include lots of sulfur and phosphorus and iron and organic carbon. Organic carbon just means molecules with lots of carbon bonds. And all of those ingredients are very handy for life. So this is a good place this place seems to have the ingredients, the nutrition that life would need to survive. The rover zeroed in on these microscopic nodules that the team refers to as leopard spots or poppy seeds. These are millimeters long. They're circular nodules with sort of concentric ring structures that are the site of chemical reactions. So some sort of chemistry happened here and it left behind these little shapes in the rock. Spectroscopic analysis by the rover identified that these nodules are rich in iron sulfide and iron phosphate minerals, most likely minerals that are known as vivianite and greigite. The chemistry and the structure of these suggest that they formed via redox reactions in the sediment. This is reduction oxidation reactions, which is when your atoms or molecules are swapping electrons. Basically, what has happened here is that some chemical reactions freed up the pieces, iron and sulfide and phosphate, which then combine together to make these minerals that form these little nodules. So these nodules are the footprints of certain types of chemical reactions. And the reason why this is exciting is because on Earth, these minerals are known to be formed by microbes as a byproduct of their metabolism. So these are microbes that break down, they're feeding on those organic compounds, but they're powering their metabolism with things like iron and sulfur, and their waste basically are the components that can then come together to make these minerals. Similar nodules with a similar composition are known on Earth in freshwater and marine sediments where microbial activity is forming them. Similar minerals are also known within some of the oldest evidence of life biosignatures on Earth. So similar age rocks on Earth have similar signs of ancient microbial activity, which is very cool.
That's pretty awesome.
Now, this is not a surefire, this was absolutely bacteria that caused this, because there are abiotic processes. There are just, naturally occurring, no life needed processes that can form these kinds of structures. But the researchers in the paper, they do a big old discussion about here are all the ways that we know of for these structures and these minerals to form without any life involved, and they all require conditions that don't seem to have been present in this ancient environment. They either require high temperatures or low pH or certain other minerals to be present, and analysis of the rocks of the Bright Angel Formation does not show signs of those conditions having been there. So these can be formed without life, but this environment doesn't seem like the kind of environment where that would have happened.
Cool.
So the researchers identify these nodules as potential biosignatures. And I'm going to read directly from the paper what that means. Quote, a feature that is consistent with biological processes and that, when encountered, challenges the researcher to attribute it either to inanimate or to biological processes, compelling them to gather more data before reaching a conclusion as to the presence or absence of life.
Yeah.
What that means is this is not surefire evidence of life on Mars. Right? There are other processes that this can be formed by, but this is a circumstance where among the ways these things could have been formed, the most likely explanation, given the evidence we have, seems to be living things.
Mm-hmm.
So, is this evidence of life on Mars? Not yet. But is it maybe the most promising potential evidence of life on Mars so far? Yeah, it does seem to be.
Well, it's a situation where this does not confirm life was here, but it is a specific enough bit of evidence that we have to basically confirm it's not evidence of life before we can just,
Yes.
we have to determine if this isn't life, we need to figure out what it is, because otherwise it quacks like bacteria.
Yeah, usually when we find potential evidence of life on Mars, it's often like, all right, we found evidence of some process that could be life, but probably wasn't.
Yes.
But it's interesting, it could be, but it probably wasn't. We're going to need more evidence if we're going to really suggest that this was life. This is a type of evidence where we need more evidence to say one way or the other. There
Yep.
isn't a clear that this isn't one that you could just go shrug. Nah, probably not. It's not that big a deal. This is one where it may turn out to not be life, but it is difficult to say with confidence in either direction, which is
Yeah.
extremely exciting.
Well, Mars is such a fascinating scenario of like the Occam's razor of like on one hand, we've got a planet that's very similar to Earth in its composition. It's smaller, but it's a rocky, very Earth-like planet. It had water at one point. It had more of an atmosphere than it has now, and it is just on the outside of the Goldilocks zone. So like it absolutely could have had survivable environments for life, but we have no direct proof of life. So it's this like, it seems perfectly reasonable, but still we're talking about alien life. So
Yes.
the burden of proof is still quite high that you need to really confirm this. Even when you have evidence that it's like, I'm struggling to think of anything else, but we need to quadruple check this
Yes.
because there might be some weird rock feature that does chemistry in a way, interacts with things in a way that actually looks a lot like a microbe colony, but that's very cool.
Now, it does sound from the description in the paper, it sounds like somewhat similar structures have also been noted other parts of the planet. So this might be a more common feature. The paper also discusses how do we go about confirming this? Like, what are the next steps? The authors suggest more field research, like looking at how these chemical reactions happen in a lab or natural setting, more modeling, more detailed models of what possible directions for these chemical reactions are. But the best way to examine further these rocks is to get our actual hands on these rocks.
Yes.
Perseverance, the rover, was at part of its mission is to collect samples with the hope that some future stage of Mars exploration will go out there and then bring the samples back. Which is something that we have no craft has ever landed on Mars and then come back to Earth.
Yeah. It's all been one-way trips other than like probes and stuff that have gone around, but even then I don't know if they've come back to Earth.
I don't know. So, Perseverance has a core sample of this rock in a little vial, and hopefully someday some craft will be able to go out there, pick it up, bring it back to Earth, and then we can study it much more in detail because we can do like isotopic studies, much more detailed mineralogical studies. We could look for other potential evidence. There's a lot. The rover's doing incredibly impressive science, but it is quite limited with what it is actually able to do up there.
Well, it only has the tools we sent with it. Like we can't anything that was invented since it was sent up, it can't have and it can't, borrow. We can't just program it to have a new device. It only has the tools it was sent with, which are vast and very cool, but still we have all the tools available here on Earth because this is where they're made.
So someday, either we send a rover that is way better at analyzing, or we send something to bring these rocks back and we get a closer look.
Very cool.
It's so cool. It's so fun. I maintain that this is my one like the thing that I feel I am realistically hopeful for, that evidence of life outside of Earth will be found in my lifetime.
Yep. That would be it'd be so awesome.
That'll be what the episode is about.
Yes.
That's just going to be the episode.
Yep, that's all we'll be talking about because we won't be able to record anything else. We'll be talking about that nonstop. Well, my news is about sharks and research into what their ancestral state most likely was, and that it's different than what most people probably would expect, just based on the popular sharks.
They were on Mars.
Yes, they all came from Mars.
These were Mars sharks.
They left their polka dots.
From the shark side of the moon.
But why are there sharks on the moon? This is research by Joel Gayford et al. In Ecology and Evolution, and the article is also by Joel in The Conversation. This study is looking at the the broad trends in evolution of sharks. Notably, that today sharks have two different body forms that you tend to see them in. And I'd never heard these terms, but I love them. The shallow bodied forms, which are typically slow moving and benthic, bottom dwelling. So, like nurse sharks, carpet sharks, cat sharks, bamboo sharks, all of those hanging on the bottom. Their tails tend to be uneven, where the top much longer than the bottom. These are very good for maneuverable but slow swimming sharks. And then the deep bodied sharks, which are your torpedo shaped great whites, bull sharks, tiger sharks, open ocean pelagic swimming sharks.
Yeah, so flat sharks and round sharks.
Yes, exactly. There's not been any research to verify that these are valid form categories and to figure out what the evolutionary origin of these shapes of sharks really is and the pattern of how they showed up. So this study did a massive review looking at shark evolution. They looked at more than 400 living shark species, and they looked at body shape information. They noted that we don't get complete fossils very often, so we can't do a detailed body shape study of sharks very easily. So they used artistic illustrations to get the gist and ancestral state reconstruction. So, comparing the animals we have now to estimate what the ancestor looked like. They collected information about different sharks throughout time, their different body shapes, and the habitats that they seemed to be living in. And we're looking at how the shifts in body shapes correlated with environmental shifts during the times to find a general pattern of shark body shape evolution throughout all of shark history. And they found some interesting things. It seems like most likely ancient sharks, the ancestral sharks, were the benthic form, were more akin to a nurse shark than a great white. And that pelagic sharks, open ocean sharks, didn't evolve until probably about the Jurassic period, 2 to 140 million years ago. So for the first half of shark existence, it's probably that most sharks were not shaped like what we typically think of as sharks, blue sharks and those fast swimming torpedo sharks, which does fit with our modern distribution of shark shapes. Most sharks today are smaller bottom dwelling sharks. That is by far the more numerous form of shark. Most sharks are not the open ocean form. There's many more species of small bottom dwellers because you get things like bamboo sharks, which max out at 2.5 feet. And there's just way more species of that size and shape of shark around the world. So it does make sense when you think of it that way. It's just not what our typical image of a shark often is.
Yeah, and I guess I would imagine that for that first half of shark evolution, there were probably other animals in the ocean taking up that swimming around in the open water. Because we talked, episode 209, we talked about chimeras and their ancient relatives, some of whom were these pelagic ones. Episode 29, we talked about placoderms back in the Devonian. Some of them might have been there. And if sharks didn't achieve this until around the Jurassic, then it might have also been like ichthyosaurs, episode 116, who were open ocean. It might not have been a while. It might have been a while before sharks had an opening.
Yes. According to their data, it looks like sharks colonized open ocean 3 to 4 times. So separate events of groups of sharks developing the more open water body shape, even more symmetrical tail and round torpedo body. And that in each of these, there was a shift in body shape that occurred just before the habitat shift, and that the timing of many of these shifts syncs up with climatic changes. Things such as rise in sea levels, rise in sea temperatures, continental fragmentation, so splitting up a fragment and making new seaways, and diversifications of things like ray fin fish and marine reptiles. That it seems like these events probably made more habitats and opened up habitats that the sharks were able to evolve into and take advantage of these new opportunities arising during these climactic shifts.
Very cool. One
Yeah.
more for the list of examples of how the famous modern example of a group is not necessarily the best representative of that group through time, or even its modern diversity.
Yeah, exactly. Like for much of their history, sharks were probably mostly slow swimmers.
Yeah.
Still probably excellent predators. Nurse sharks and carpet sharks are excellent predators going after fish and shellfish and crustaceans, but not taking down animals at the surface, and breaching in dramatic ways like great whites or chasing them down like a blue shark. Probably more low energy predators.
Very cool. Well, my second bit of news is I'm going back to microbes, although this time on Earth, but still ancient. This is ancient microbial DNA from mammoths.
Ooh.
This is research published in Cell by Benjamin Gwinnett et al. And we'll link in the blog post to an article on Smithsonian Magazine by Sarah Kuta. Ancient DNA, episode 34. We've talked about this a whole bunch. You can get ancient DNA from fossil remains. You can get them sometimes from ancient sediments. Very useful. Ancient DNA has been found over 1 million years into the past. Very handy for identifying ancient species and evolutionary trends. But most ancient DNA research is done on the animal, right? Mammoths and dire wolves and the ancient big animals. Not very much is known about ancient microbial communities. In particular, the microbes that lived in and on ancient animals.
Yeah.
This research sought to basically say, can we get a bunch of DNA samples from mammoth fossils, and can we identify microbes that were living in and on those mammoths? So the way that they did this is that they got DNA samples from 483 mammoths.
Whoa.
These samples came from teeth, tusks, bones, some skin tissues. Of these 483 samples, 440 of them are newly sequenced, newly published. So a whole bunch more mammoth DNA samples. Very cool.
Awesome.
These came from across North America, particularly up in the Alaska, North America region, and Northeast Asia. The youngest samples came from Wrangel Island, and they were only about 4,000 years old, some of the very latest surviving mammoths. The oldest samples came from a steppe mammoth from Russia that is 1.1 million years old. This one was in the news a few years ago for being the oldest ancient DNA ever successfully recovered from an animal like this. In these samples, they found lots of mammoth DNA and also identified DNA from more than 300 different types of microbes. Now, most of these seem to have been from the environment, right? This is obviously an animal, especially a dead animal, is going to be covered in all sorts of different bacteria and other microbes. They noted that most of these different types of microbes are very similar to species that are found in ancient Arctic sediments. So these might just be soil bacteria. These are not clearly directly associated with this animal in life. But 6 of them do not match known environmental microbes and instead match microbes that are known to live in and on animals. These include, I think there were 4 genera of them, Actinobacillus, which the strain they found is similar to bacteria found in some livestock, for example, pigs and cows. Typically, these are found in the mouth, and they did note that all of the ancient samples of this came from the teeth of these mammoths. They found Streptococcus, similar to strains that are associated with causing tooth cavities in humans. These were also all found from the mammoth teeth. They found DNA that looked like Pasturella, similar to a strain that back in 2020, a half dozen African elephants died due to what appears to have been an infection of this type of bacteria. Although whether or not these ancient mammoths were sick is hard, possibly impossible to tell, but they do seem to have hosted a similar bacteria. And Erysipelathrix, which is a bacteria, similar strains in modern animals have been linked to endocarditis in dogs and pigs. And this last one, this Erysipelathrix bacteria, these were the only samples not found in teeth. They were found in bone tissues.
Oh.
And this one, they got enough to put together a partial genome of this ancient bacteria. And since they identified this from that super ancient steppe mammoth at just over 1 million years old, this is the oldest known partial genome of a host associated microbe.
That's so awesome.
So they found a bunch of microbial DNA that seems to have been part of the microbiome of these mammoths. They do note in the paper that this is sort of a proof of concept study. This was a first attempt. They looked at almost 500 samples. They got a ton of DNA. Now, what they would like to do in the future is look at other parts of the body. They did specifically mention like dental calculus, the plaque that builds up in the teeth. They also noted that if they can collect sediments from the fossil sites that these fossils themselves come from, that will allow a much more direct comparison. So it sounds like in this paper, when they were comparing for environmental microbes, they weren't able to compare the fossil microbes with the sediment from that actual fossil's location, because often we're not collecting sediment at the same time as fossils. So they suggest that in the future, doing that will allow for comparisons between the microbial DNA in the fossil and the actual sediment that the fossil was buried in, which will really refine, like for sure, it doesn't seem like these were local soil bacteria or anything like that.
So cool. That's very neat. Like, we're getting a look at the microbiome of mammoths.
Yeah.
Is one of those things, as we've mentioned this with lots of cool new technological advances in paleontology. Had you asked me 10 years ago of will we ever know what like the stuff living inside mammoths was? It's like, I mean, probably not. That's how would we know that? And yet here we are. That's so cool. Awesome. Well, my last bit of news is about something slightly bigger than a microbe. It's about ants, but specifically the animals that eat ants and how many times that lifestyle has evolved. This is research by Thomas Vida et al. In Evolution, and the article is by Michelle Starr in Science Alert. So, ants and termites are pretty much ubiquitous around the world except for like Arctic regions. They are one of the most influential land animals on our planet. There are evidently a recent study estimated that there's a number of individual ants at around 20 quadrillion on our planet.
Sure. That sounds like an ant kind of number.
That's an ant amount of number.
There are approximately 1 antillion.
Yes, exactly. Their combined biomass is likely to be about 12 megatons of dry carbon, which is more than all the wild mammals and birds combined. This is according to the article, and about 20% of the human biomass on Earth. So ants are kind of a big deal. We go over this in the ants episode quite thoroughly.
Episode 149.
So therefore, a bunch of organisms have evolved in response to this abundance of organisms. Specifically, a lifestyle we've seen evolve multiple times is anteaters. Ant-eating animals whose diet is effectively entirely ants and termites, some combination of the two or a preference to one. These are known as myrmecophages or myrmecophagy. They tend to show similar features: toothless, elongated mouths, a long, powerful, often sticky tongue, typically strong foreclaws for getting into the nest. They also have some things that you might not expect, like typically have lower body temperatures and metabolism, having enzyme adaptations for processing chitin And these are likely things that are helping them survive on a very abundant but low energy food.
Yeah, these are features that we think of in anteater, like the animals that are called anteaters, but you also get very similar features in like aardvarks, and there's a bunch of these ant or termite specialists.
Yes, exactly. We see some kind of ant specialist in all three major types of mammals: placentals, marsupials, and monotremes. You have echidnas and pangolins and noonbats and anteaters and aardvarks, all which have these specializations for going after ants as their main food source. It was quoted in the article, one of the most striking examples of convergent evolution among our modern animals for sure. They wanted to try to understand this trend of anteater lifestyle evolution, mammals evolving into anteaters. They looked at social insect fossil record, ant and termite evolutionary history, and they compared it to a review that they did of more than 600 published sources on mammal evolution, and compiled a database of the dietary habits of 4,099 mammal species to compare the trends of the two. They divided the animals into 5 categories based on their diets: insectivores, insect eaters; carnivores, your meat eaters; omnivores, and then herbivores, and obligate myrmecophages.
Mm-hmm.
Then they mapped this data set that they've created onto the mammal family tree to figure out where the evolutionary trends, who evolved from who, how many times do we see it evolve, et cetera, et cetera. And they found that ant eating has evolved at least 12 times in mammals,
Whew.
with 2 more instances that they weren't able to confirm. But
Okay.
at least 12 individual evolutions of dedicated ant eating, and all during the Cenozoic, so all since the Cretaceous.
Yeah.
There have been multiple pathways that they took to get there, and they all stemmed from insectivorous or carnivorous ancestors. So one's already eating insects, or meat eaters that then shifted to eating ants. And among all of it, they only recovered one reversal out of being an anteater to one of the other diets, which likely is evidence of either ants being such a good food source that there's rarely pressures to evolve away from it, or that there may be difficulty in evolving your normal diet tools. If you've lost your teeth and become so specialized, you might not be able to stop eating ants once you
Right.
dedicate
You
to it.
might have evolved into a corner.
Exactly. One of the interesting parts of this is the fairly recent evolution of many of the forms, considering that both lineages go back into the Cretaceous, but we don't see any evidence of anteaters evolving until a good bit after the Cretaceous. It sounded like the majority of them were like in the Miocene and onward.
Yeah. Interesting. What
And
was stopping mammals from eating ants before that?
yes, indeed. They note that it does seem likely that the pattern of ants' distribution on Earth has not always been what it is today, where they rule the world. They noted that the prevalence of ant and termite fossils are not as high in the Cretaceous as they are after, and that we don't seem to see the occurrence of large colonies until you get into the Cenozoic. So after the Cretaceous.
I was wondering if it was like the colony evolution.
Yeah. We've noted this when we've talked about fossil ants, that there are tons of fossil ants in the Cretaceous, but many of them seem to indicate that they weren't as social as our modern ants are. So they weren't the super organism, often like individualistic hunters, probably still living in a colony, but maybe not a colony of millions, maybe a colony of hundreds.
Right. Episode 111 for eusociality.
They also noted that early in the Cenozoic, according to the fossil record, ants represented about 1% of the insect population, and that percentage rises drastically in the Miocene about 23 million years ago. So it's likely that there weren't enough ants effectively for you to have a bunch of anteaters before fairly recently.
That's so cool.
Right?
Because it really drives home how big a deal ants are.
Yep.
That, like, in much the same way, we talked about this in episode 173, herbivory couldn't evolve proper, like true herbivory didn't evolve until there were plants around to eat. Like,
Yes.
unless, so like herbivores proper don't really show up until like the Carboniferous, because before that there's not enough plants. The idea that ants, one of the things that ants share with vegetation is that at a certain point they became so successful that an entirely different dietary lifestyle developed to take advantage of them.
Yeah.
That's what we talked about in the Snake Month live stream. I think we mentioned there was this study recently about burrowing snakes and how their anal cloacal secretions seem to be a dedicated defense against ants.
Yep, because you were going into their world.
They're just so influential on the planet that for some animals, you might as well just eat them.
Yeah, there's a great quote in the article of them noting that this really emphasizes what engineers of convergent evolution ants are, citing things like there's also thousands of species that mimic ants to gain the defenses of being an ant or have biochemical signaling or defenses like the snakes against ants. But they also noted, and this is tons of fun, because they at one point compared, this trend of convergent evolution as similar to carcinization, the evolution of crab-like body shapes. But at the end of the article, they noted that if you take in the amount of times it's happened in both, it's happened twice as many with anteaters as it has with crab body forms.
So the new meme
yeah,
is that as ants slowly take over the world, everything eventually converges on ant eating.
Yeah, myrmecophagy. Oh, what would it be? Myrmecophagization? Something around like
someday in the distant future, there will only be two ways to live. And you will either be an ant or you will eat ants.
Yes. And with that, we will wrap up our news and move into our discussion, where we will continue to talk about toothless animals that have become surprisingly successful as we go into what are beaks and who has them. Beaks are a structure that, much like we did in the episode on horns, is a feature that many organisms have, but there's one group that is famous for them and that we define beaks by.
Yes.
A beak, generally speaking, is a toothless mouth with a keratin, so like our fingernails, covering over the jaw. This keratin sheath has a name. It is the rhamphotheca.
Mm-hmm.
That's the term used for a beak in many research, and when you see it discussed in studies, the rhamphotheca is that keratin covering of a toothless mouth.
Yes, this is it's a fun place to start, like we did with horns and antlers in episode 140, and like we did with tusks in episode 107, where we all know what we're talking about, but if we're gonna do a scientific overview, we have to find the scientific definition.
Yes.
And what does that end up including and excluding?
Absolutely. By this definition, only birds and turtles have beaks.
Mm-hmm.
True beaks. Now, you may be saying right now, but wait, we will get to the other beaked or beakish creatures very shortly.
Yes. False beaks.
Exactly. Beaks are a mode of having a mouth. And I found one paper that put it in a really fun way that tetrapods, so us limbed animals, have really come up with two ways of having a mouth. Toothed and beaked are the two main ways. Yep. There are some toothless and non-beaked mouths, but those are actually very rare.
Yeah, generally speaking, tetrapods like to have some sort of hard chomping structure. in
Yes.
the mouth. And if you don't have teeth, you need something else, and it tends to be a beak.
They broke it down, and this was just fun that they said among the roughly 30,000 living tetrapod species, 2/3 are toothed reptiles, amphibians, and mammals, and then most of the remaining are beaked birds.
Mm-hmm.
So this structure is incredibly useful and a great tool for feeding and many other things. To go through some terms about the beak. First off, is it a beak or a bill? It does not matter. Those words mean the same thing. They are fully interchangeable. There is no official definition of what a bill is.
Sure.
Typically, if you're asking an ornithologist, they will use bill more often than beak.
Oh, interesting.
I saw one thing noting that. Now, there might be ornithologists that are like, no, we don't. And if that's true, let me know. But I
Yes.
saw it said that among ornithologist literature,
in my mind, I can feel that this is my reaction. And any ornithologist out there that want to at me, feel free.
yes,
In my mind, if it's on a duck, it's a bill.
yes,
And basically everywhere else, it's a beak.
exactly. And that was one thing it also noted that ducks, geese, other water birds are often called bills. And often these are have more like fleshy components, softer components to them.
Yeah. That they're not quite that hard. Like, I wouldn't call an eagle's beak a bill.
Exactly.
Right. But a duck's bill is a bill. And therefore, by comparison, a platypus also has a bill.
Exactly. Yes. So that term, that's fully, it's very much like when we talk about groupings of animals, of like, why is this one a herd, but that similar animal is not a herd? Well, it's because it's just vibes based. These are not
Yes.
official terms.
We'll use the word beak so that we don't have to say Ramphotheca every time
Yes,
we're
exactly.
referring to the structure.
Exactly. And that's what we put in the title. So, Beaks.
Ramphotheca.
Ramphotheca. Another term that comes up with beaks very often is edentalism, which is toothlessness.
Yeah.
That modern beaks are toothless structures. Not all beaks are toothless. We will get into that as we discuss the variety of beaks. But this toothlessness or some amount of tooth loss is extremely common among beaks because, as a general rule, you can't have both a beak and teeth at wherever you have one on the jaw.
Right. The two groups today that are defined by beaks, turtles and birds, which both universally have a beak, also universally have no teeth.
Yes. And as we will discuss, typically if you have a beak on part of your jaw, you do not have teeth there.
Yes, they are often mutually exclusive.
Exactly. The Ramphotheca, the beak, the keratin sheath. And this is one of those where you'll see some things discuss beaks and they're talking about the bone, because if you're talking about a fossil, you do not have the keratin sheath. So the beak is kind of both the underlying bone that makes the pointy face and this keratin sheath, the Ramphotheca.
Mhm.
But often you will see if they describe a beak, they are describing this sheath, this keratin.
Yeah. Again, similar to what we talked about with horns in
Yes.
episode 140, that there is the horn core, which is the bony interior, and then there is the horn sheath on the outside. But we don't refer to a beak core because the beak core is just the face. that's
Exactly.
the bones of the skull.
Yes, yes. The beak core, as in the bird.
Yes.
This is a structure that covers both the upper and lower jaw. They are separated into the rhinotheca, the upper one, and the gnathotheca, the lower one. Our modern birds, this covers the entire outer and inner surfaces of those jaw bones. So they go around the lower jaw, above the upper jaw, and inside the mouth, the palate and lower jaw of the bird. This is a continuously growing structure. There's a vascular layer between this and the deeper layers of the skin. So it grows very much like our fingernails and has to be worn down through use. Birds in human care often have to have beak trimmings, or else they will get misshapen beaks as they overgrow. Some birds, which I didn't know this, shed part of their beaks.
Oh.
Yeah, puffins shed part of their beak each year after the breeding season. And pelicans, some pelicans have what's called a billhorn, which is something that develops during breeding season, and they shed that. Yeah.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that.
All right, so we got pronghorn birds. Most birds today have a seamless sheath. The Ramphotheca is one solid piece. But there are some families with some species, things like albatrosses and emu, that have what's called a compound Ramphotheca that consists of several parts and are separated by these keratinous grooves that where the parts meet up. And this is the ancestral condition, and we will discuss it later on when we get into the fossil record.
Oh, interesting. That's cool
Yeah.
because that is the comparison that comes to mind is the lower jaws of mammals,
Yeah.
which ancestrally, the ancestors of mammals' lower jaws were multiple bones, just as they are in reptiles and other animals. But in modern mammals, each side of the lower jaw has been reduced down to one single bone. The idea
Yes.
that birds have done the same thing with their beaks is very cool.
Yeah. It's super neat. Another portion that gets mentioned and that we will be mentioning is the tomia, which is the edges, the cutting edges of the beak. So where our teeth would be, that edge of the beak and the jaw. You'll also come across the nail, which is not on all beaks, but in ducks, geese, and swan, they have this extra hard, horny bit at the end of the beak that is used in their feeding. You'll get different kinds of structures. It's this kind of shield shaped structure. It's what gives them that little cute overbite at the end of the bill.
Yeah.
It sometimes spans the entire width. It is often bent to form a bit of a hook. It can be used for different purposes, like some use them to like dig out seeds of them from the mud or vegetation. Others, like diving ducks, use it to pry mollusks off rocks. So it is a feature of this group of waterfowl.
Cool. You have a little crowbar on your face.
Yeah. Now, as you may have noticed, most of that was focused on bird beaks because of our beaked animals, birds are by far the dominant group.
Yeah, birds aren't the only animals who have evolved beaks, but they are the ones who have done it the best. Birds have won
Yes.
at beaks.
Oh, yeah. So we will be focusing on them heavily this episode. So I felt it was only fair to start with everybody else so that they don't just get mentioned as an afterthought.
So bird gotta knock those birds down a couple notches.
Yes, you wait, birds. You've had your time. And you will have it again, but a little bit later. Turtles. Turtles are the only other animal today that has what, by this definition, is a true beak, a toothless mouth that is covered in a keratin sheath. It's very different in structure many times, like it has very different shapes, but they are also quite diverse. They also have that cutting edge along the side. You get a bunch of different kinds of beaks, sharp beaks like snapping turtles for catching food, blunt beaks for grinding food, like in tortoises. Sea turtles often will have these kind of almost grinding surface on their teeth, on their beaks to take on different food. And this is something that you will see different in them than in birds. That turtles do chew their food. They will
Yeah.
process it with their mouth. Birds do not. They have a different structure for that, which we will get into. I did not find a ton on like the evolution of turtle beaks, but I did find mentioning that the fossil record of turtles beaks show up in kind of an interesting pattern. So famously, Odontochelys, the toothed turtle, which
Hmm.
was at one point our earliest fossil turtle. We now have older ones, but this is the one well known for having a lower shell. It has a plastron, but not a carapace, so not a back shell, and teeth. So it was a toothed half turtle, but there's another one, Eorhynchocheles, which is another Triassic turtle, much like Odontochelys. This one is a 6 foot long turtle with a round body and a long tail, but no shell yet. It has like expanded ribs,
Hmm.
but not a shell, and not a plastron. It doesn't sound like no shell whatsoever by what we would consider a turtle shell, but a beak. So we have one turtle that has part of a shell and no beak, and another that has no shell and a beak, which suggests that in the ancestry of turtles, that they didn't have a single evolution of these features, that it was mosaic with different groups evolving different parts, and then finally one lineage that led to our modern turtles evolved both.
Yes.
So it seems like they were all kind of messing with these two features in different orders.
Yeah, the fact that you had early turtle relatives some of which had teeth, some of which had toothed beaks, and some of which had toothless beaks,
Yeah.
suggesting that at this time period in this lineage, it was sort of a variable feature, is A, really interesting, and B, sounds like foreshadowing for what I know we will be talking about later in the episode.
What are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about.
For more on turtle evolution, episode 60.
Yes, absolutely. Speaking of ancient beaks, there were other, what we would likely consider true beaks. Now, it's hard to know exactly what their keratin, beak sheath thing was going on back then, since this does not typically fossilize. But there are other fossil groups that have very beak-like faces and seem to show signs of having some sort of keratin covering. The dicynodonts are a famous fossil group, well known for being beaked. These are therapsids, non-mammalian, but closer cousins to us than reptiles. They're from the Permian and Triassic. This is a extremely successful group, like 80 to 90 different genera known, and ranging from like rat size to like small elephant sized ones. And they, as a rule, often had tusks and a toothless beaked mouth.
Yup.
Their skull seems to be specialized in that it's light but strong. They have very large jaw muscle attachments, and the beak is narrow and toothless. And when they close their mouth, the meeting of the beak and the retraction of the jaw created this shearing effect, which likely was part of why they were able to process a bunch of different foods and be so successful that they had these hedge trimmer mouths able to take on tough plant food.
Very cool. A bit more about them in episode 47.
Absolutely. Another one is rhynchosaurs. These were another Triassic group. These were archosauromorphs, so reptiles close to archosaur, closer to the group that includes crocs and dinosaurs. They were also quite numerous. In some fossil sites, they were like 40 to 60% of specimens found. And they have these stocky little bodies. They're very dicynodont in many ways. Longer tail, more reptilian body shape, but still these stocky little dudes with a very triangular shaped skull that was like wide in the back, narrow in the front, and the front narrow part was this big hooked, almost parrot looking beak. They also had a diversity of sizes. Some early members were small, and the description was looked very much like a lizard, except for with a beak, which I love the image of. Later members got bigger and had much more pronounced beaks and broad heads. They also had this very specialized shearing beak going on, where the upper and lower jaw fit into each other. They compared it to like when you close a pocket knife and the blade goes into the handle.
Sure.
So this very scissor-like action. They did have teeth, though they were weird. They said on the upper jaw and the palate, so the roof of the mouth, they had broad tooth plates. So
Okay.
probably crushing or grinding surfaces. And they had these big hind claws on the hind feet, likely for digging up stuff. So they may have been going for like tough roots and tubers and stuff.
Yeah, or like snails and
Yeah.
the hard-shelled things.
Yes. So we do have some other potentially true beaks. I didn't see any details on what we think the keratin sheath may or may not have been like on them, but
Mm-hmm.
it does seem like the shape is highly suggestive of other beaks we know had that kind of structure. So
Yes.
it would make sense. There is one other group that I found that could be argued to be a beaked, and that is tadpoles.
I have heard tadpoles referred to as beaked.
Yeah, tadpoles, so the juvenile forms of frogs, most of them are grazers. If not strictly herbivorous, they scrape food off of rocks and surfaces in the water. This is something called periphyton, which could include things like detritus, so like poop and junk, algae, small invertebrates, just things growing and stuck to the rocks. That's what they're doing when they're doing their little mouth movements. Their mouth is what's called an oral disc, and the upper and lower margins of the disc have two thick layers of keratinized skin cells that are very much kind of a beak.
Yeah.
These are supported by cartilage, and they can be smooth or serrated. The upper one typically is a smooth arch, and the lower one is more of a notched V in shape. And the cartilage allows them to be somewhat flexible so they can adhere to the surface of whatever they're scraping food off of. But by the definition of a toothless mouth that's covered in a keratin sheath, arguably a beak.
I really like when we explore these kinds of features and explore what defines it and where do we draw the line, that it always ends up illustrating that there is a continuum, that there
Yes.
are things that are beaks and then there are things that are kind of beaks or doing a
Mm-hmm.
similar thing to beaks, that it isn't, beak is not a yes or a no. Some
Yes.
animals have a maybe or sometimes beak.
Exactly. This is probably my favorite of like this one only doesn't get the title of beak by a very specific technicality, and that is cephalopod beaks.
Yeah, yeah, because this is a famous thing about
Hmm.
octopus and squid and cuttlefish is that amidst all the tentacles, they have a beak, a hard chomping structure that we've talked about in part because they fossilize. You get
Exactly.
fossilized squid beaks and such.
This is one of the only tough parts of, especially like octopuses, which have gotten rid of their shell and even don't have much of a mantle anymore. This is one of the only tough parts of the body.
Isn't it true about octopuses that they can squeeze through space as long as their beak can fit through it?
Yeah, to my knowledge, there's the beak, and there is a cartilage ring for like octopuses around where the brain is.
Okay, those are the two non-compressible parts of an octopus.
Exactly. These beaks are extremely beaky. Like, this isn't like the tadpole beak where it's like, all right, that is a deconstructed beak. Like, that is your interpretation of a beak. This looks like you took a parrot beak and shoved it inside an octopus. They
Sure
are
does.
so it is like when you show someone an octopus beak and then tell them it came from an octopus. I've often had the reaction of no, it's not. Like that's a bird beak, obviously. It's like no, it's not. The one thing that makes it not technically a true beak is that it is chitinized, not keratinized.
That was going to be my guess, is that it isn't
Yep,
actually keratin.
it is a separate material. So most invertebrates are dealing with their hard body part is chitin, while
Hmm.
in us vertebrates, we make our hard skin parts out of keratin. So it's just different groups preferring different hard bits in how they grow and develop. So it technically does not fit. It does not come from the keratinized region of the animal family tree, so it is not a true beak.
Yes, we recognize that you are a hardened, toothless structure that shears food, but we do not grant you the title of beak.
And then the octopus just ominously bubbles. These beaks, though, are so cool. These are used in prey capture and processing because, as a general rule, the vast majority of cephalopods are predatory,
Hmm.
capturing prey using this beak to then eat it. But also, this is the way they inject their venomous bites.
Ooh, yeah.
Like this sharp beak is what allows them to have their venomous saliva help to paralyze their prey and incapacitate it.
Which does make them the first venomous beaks on our
Yep.
list, and maybe the only ones.
Yeah, exactly. Like, which is so cool. These beaks are also useful because very many cephalopods are going after like crabs and hard shelled things. So they're using it to
Yeah.
crack into the armor.
Kraken.
Yes, yep. It's totally on purpose. This also allows them to eat prey in bite sized chunks so that they don't have to eat things that just are big enough for them to swallow. They can eat large prey and chow down on it. As you mentioned, it being one of the only hard parts on a cephalopod, it's one of the only things that preserves in the fossil record. We can get other things like tentacle hooks and stuff like that, but this is most common. It's also one of the only things that's going to preserve in modern ecosystems that we can do surveys of cephalopod beaks more easily than doing surveys of the cephalopods because
Yes.
in the bellies of their predators, you can find these beaks.
I was going to say that I believe is why we know sperm whales eat squid
Yeah,
is because they have
exactly.
squid beaks in their bellies.
Yes. And now I saw the video going around of we finally have a video of a spermal coming up with a giant squid in its mouth. Which is like, now we know. But yeah, that was our first evidence, was these giant honking beaks in these whales that we were massacring.
There's also fossil ambergris from ancient sperm whales that I believe was identified as ambergris in part because it had squid beaks in it.
That's so cool. That's awesome. This is useful because squid beaks, cephalopod beaks, are also really identifiable. They can be identified down to specific groups. They're very distinct group to group because there's a huge amount of variety in the overall shape of the beaks. And this variety was often assumed to be attributed to ecological roles, feeding styles and what they're hunting and eating.
Sure, makes sense.
Yeah, but as far as I was able to find, it seems like that's contentious because when they've actually looked into it and done the studies, some studies have found effectively no association with beak shape and food source.
Interesting.
There have been others that they have found some patterns that they do match trophic level from like pelagic, so open ocean, to benthic seafloor dwelling, and that there does seem to be a pattern that beaks range across a spectrum from fast closing to hard biting. But it doesn't seem that there is a solid pattern in that fish eaters have this kind of beak and crustacean eaters have this kind of beak, which is what we often expect when we see a lot of different kinds of mouth types. So it seems like there's some evidence that kind of leans that way, some that doesn't. They can find information about what they're eating by looking at the isotopes. So looking at specific isotopes of the beak when we sample modern beaks. And I did find mentions of fossil beaks from like ammonites, noting that there does seem to be a trend in different kinds of beaks among ammonites. They know that some of them possess blunt-edged lower jaws that have a slit rather than a thickening along the midline, and that these seem like they were likely probably better for processing large prey, while others have a shorter rostrum, so mouth region, and the upper jaws are relatively blunt and weakly tanned, which I think has to do with what they're made out of. And they have a multicuspid radula, which is that toothy tongue that mollusks have. And that these seem like they were likely better for zooplankton feeders. I didn't see any other
Interesting.
specifics. And that nautiloids, many of them have jaws with calcareous coverings, so calcium-based coverings, and robust radula that likely would make them suited for scavenging.
Interesting. That's pretty cool to know.
Yeah, it seemed like there's some information to be gleaned from cephalopod beak shape and what they were eating, but not as much as you would expect from a mouth part. Staying in the ocean, there are other beaked animals that will famously be described as beaked, but are not actually beaked. Things like the parrotfish and pufferfish will often be described as having beaks, but in both of these cases, these are teeth. So they have these tooth structures that are very beak-esque, and in the parrotfish, exposed out of the mouth. So it looks very much like a beak, but they are actually teeth. In the parrotfish, this is like thousands of little teeth fused together into this hard, solid structure that is evidently really intense. And I'm mentioning parrotfish because one of our requesters requested parrotfish, and their not beak is really cool. They eat coral. So parrotfish crunch into hard coral to eat the polyps and the zooxanthellae algae inside the coral, and then they poop out the skeleton as sand. To eat such hard food, their teeth are incredibly strong. Some of the toughest teeth in the world, like among animals we know. They have a crystal structure that is made out of fluorapatite and is the second hardest biomineral that this paper knew of in the world.
Cool.
It is a 5 on the Mohs hardness scale, which makes it harder than copper, silver, and gold.
That's 5 on Mohs for a part of an animal's body is intense.
Yes. And they noted that no biomineral is stiffer than this one. So this one is just a very robust one. And the crystals are orientated in this interwoven structure that they compared to like chainmail. and it gives it this very hard edge to withstand the incredible pressure of biting through coral. So that's pretty cool.
Very cool.
The pufferfish beak is also fused teeth. These are tooth plates, and we find these tooth plates in the fossil record. They're these really robust little tooth beaks, and they use them to just bite into whatever animal they want. I don't want to like suggest it because these videos are not great, but there's a bunch of videos of people feeding various things to their pet pufferfish, and they just bite things in half, and just wherever they bite, that part of that animal is just gone. It's brutal. There are other animals that have beaky structures that often are called beaked, but are not very beaky in many ways. You get things like beaked whales, which we talked about in our toothed whales episode.
Yep, episode 172.
Which the dolphin snout sometimes is referred to as a beak.
Yes.
And that's where the beak of these whales come from. These whales are mostly toothless. They don't have many feeding teeth. They will have like little tusk teeth, but there's no keratin covering. That's about as much similarity they have. This also goes for monotremes, the duck-billed platypus, and the short or long-beaked echidnas. Like, we put bill and beak in the name of these mammals because they have long, toothless mouths. And the platypus even has this very flattened duckbill-like structure, but their faces are not keratinized. They are more leathery. The bill is very leathery in its texture. They do have keratin chewing surfaces inside the mouth on the platypus. So beak-ish.
Yeah, very beak-esque, beak-adjacent.
Yeah, yes. Probably, though, evolved for slightly different reasons, because monotremes also use electroreception, detecting electrical charges to hunt their food. So their beaks may be more related to that than other beaked animals. So probably a similar structure for very different reasons.
Yes. Episode 166 for more about monotremes.
And then I did see one paper that talked about weevils, which are the long snouted insects, and refer to that structure as a beak.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to bring up insects, because I have seen specifically herbivorous insects like weevils, and I think I've seen this for some other similar like hemipterans, that sometimes those mouth parts are called a beak.
Yes. I found that seems to be very inconsistent when it's called a beak, because like
Sure.
I found a paper that called it a beak, but if you go to the Wikipedia about weevils, beak is not in that Wikipedia article.
Yes, if you control F, you do not find beak.
Exactly, which is what I did to be like, is this something that they are regularly called? Should I have a section? But you do get beak used for typically any long mouth.
Yeah.
If the mouth is elongated, often beak will get described at some point, just because that's what is common in most beaks we know today among birds.
Yes, and I was about to say, you'll notice that so many of the things that we want to call beaks, whether they are true beaks or not, are called beaks based on similarity to birds.
Yes.
Birds are the gold standard of what is a beak. Sorry, apologies to turtles. Birds are what beak is. And that is, it speaks to their prevalence that everything else gets called beak or not based on how bird-like it is.
Yep. Birds are arguably, and I saw also just said, the most diverse and successful beaked amniote.
Absolutely.
Arguably beaked animal.
Yes. And they are, and this is, and you know, just for the benefit of any listeners who are worried that we left something out, birds and some of their ancient cousins, which we will get to, are an extremely successful lineage of beak evolution, beakedness.
Absolutely. Their beaks have taken on a ton of forms and are used in a variety of ways. I do not have a list of cool bird beak examples, because that's what we would be doing for the rest of the run of the podcast.
That's a different podcast, and I did Google cool bird beaks. There are so many of them.
Yes, exactly. They can be used in a ton of different ways. Feeding, obviously, because it is the mouth, but also preening. They are these structures for cleaning the feathers and organizing them. They're used in voice modulation and sound production. The shoebill stork with its machine gun mouth.
Yep.
There are ones that have display structures that are worked into the beak. Many birds use it as thermoregulation, as a way to off-put heat. Toucans are famous for this.
Mm-hmm.
This is also the way they interact with their environment. So nest building, tool use are done by the beak.
Yep. The woodpeckers, when they are
Mm-hmm.
foraging, are punching through trees with the beak.
Yep. Pelicans have turned their beak into this expandable net that
Yes.
catches fish.
Hummingbirds use their beaks to attack each other.
Yes,
They'll like
exactly.
spear each other with the beak. A lot of hummingbirds and other birds also, their beaks will have different shapes based on what flowers they're getting nectar from.
The list goes on and on. Bird, if there's something you can do with a beak, a bird has done it and is often doing it very well around the
Yes.
world.
Hop in the comments or on the Discord and let us know your favorite examples of birds doing cool stuff with their beaks.
Birds have a number of adaptations to be able to be beaked and successful. One is a very mobile jaw. They have a flexible jaw, so they don't just have this stiff face with no teeth. They can actually use that beak much more like we would use chopsticks to nimbly grab onto and manipulate things. So that's why birds seem so much more dexterous with what seems like a very stiff structure. Their skull is moving more than ours can move. They also have the gizzard, which has seemingly taken on the role of food processing instead of teeth. The gizzard is the upper portion, the muscular portion of the bird's stomach that often is full of grit and bits of stone to grind up and help process whatever food the bird swallows. This, of course, is not necessary to be beaked. Turtles do not have a gizzard, but they also do seem to have more of a chewing capability. So it could be that to have a bird style beak, you may need some form of secondary processing to be able to handle food the way they do.
Sure. Or it could be that in order to eat as much variety of food as birds eat, you have to have that gizzard. Because there are plenty of animals that swallow their food whole and don't have
Yes,
any sort of gizzard structure, but birds have extremely diverse diets.
exactly. So that's probably one of the reasons they've been able to be so successful with a toothless mouth and yet take over the world. The diversity of beak shapes is often presented as a example of organisms adapting to different food sources and different feeding styles. This observation is famous and was first really made famous by Darwin's finches.
Yep.
So Darwin, you may have heard of him,
Episode 28.
put forth his hypothesis of natural selection, large parts due to his trip to the Galapagos Islands, where he experienced the diversity of life. And one big part of that research, his observations, and one of the most famous things that was made public knowledge were the finches of these islands. Roughly 18 species, according to the updated Wikipedia, that are found on the various islands and are notably distinct from one another. They have their own songs and food preferences, but the famous bit is each one has a different beak specialized for what that bird is eating. Things like cactus finches have longer, more pointed beaks for picking seeds out of cactus fruits. Ground finches have shorter, stouter beaks for taking on seeds that they find on the ground. Warbler finches have beaks that are even thinner and more pointed for catching insects. There is a great quote from Darwin that I saw in one paper that was one species had been taken and modified for different ends. He noted that these all seem to be very similar birds, but have been specialized in these different ways, and came to the hypothesis that an ancestral bird arrived on the island, and when on the islands, and when encountering the different situations on each island and competing with different organisms, had to specialize in different ways. So this was a huge moment in us understanding evolution and the public perception of natural selection and adaptation. Similar specializations in beak shape have been noted in other groups of birds. Crossbills and warblers, scrub jays, shorebirds and raptors and stuff like that have all had similar observations made, but much like with the cephalopod beaks, I found some papers that questioned whether this really is as consistent across birds as it is often portrayed, because research on it has actually only ever been done, for the most part, historically, in specific groups, not
Sure.
as wide ranging. And were mostly tested on perching birds, passerine birds. Some studies that did more detailed analysis with more updated measurement tools and across a wider variety found actually quite little pattern of food and feeding preference to beak shape. One paper noted that most aspects of the beak show a significant relationship with feeding ecology, but little explanatory power. So, though there does seem to be trends, it doesn't seem to be able that you can predict. And that diet seemed to account for less than 12% of beak shape variation.
Interesting.
You see similar beak shapes across many different diet regimes, and that most birds seem to exhibit fairly similar beaks, fast, weak bites, even across like big predatory groups, and that in raptors, beak shape variation and feeding ecology was more strongly correlated with skull size.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it doesn't seem like it's for sure. There are some groups that it does seem to be a good trend in. One other paper noted that in waterfowls, ducks and their cousins, it does seem like they have fairly consistent trends, and the shape of the bill or the beak matches what they're going to be eating.
Longtime listeners of the podcast will not be surprised to see Will do a little bit of a deep dive into scientists discovering that their assumptions about what mouth shape means in terms of diet are incorrect.
I find it fast. I love how often we're like, this shape is obviously for this. And I always have a thought of, I can do a lot more with a hammer than you're supposed to do with a hammer. If you have a screwdriver, you've got a chisel, you've got a pry bar, you've got an ice pick, like you can do a lot more with a tool than what it was designed for. So just because that's what it's ideal for doesn't mean that's all the animal was doing with it.
Yeah.
And now for the section of the beak discussion that people might not expect there to be, beak teeth.
Right, teeth and beaks.
Let's talk about toothy beaks.
Which I learned is not supposed to happen.
You're not supposed to do that.
Not supposed to have teeth in your beak. That's one of the things, that's one of the defining features, as I was taught by my friend Will, like half an hour ago.
Yes, it is a rule. Modern birds and modern beaks are all from toothless mouths, but there are tooth-ish things that we find in association with beaks, modern beaks. One being the egg tooth.
Yes.
Baby birds have this little horny structure, this calcified bit on the end of their beak that they use to chip the shell of their egg. Often, many of them will chip in a circle to make a little hatch. And this is how they break out of their egg. They have this little horn-ish thing on the end of their snout. This is not a true tooth. It is not made out of the same stuff as tooth. It is a integument structure, so more like scales and claw. Like it is something from the skin, but it is a very important feature for most birds. If the chick does not develop an egg tooth, it does not hatch.
Mm-hmm.
It is a fatal flaw if they do not develop the egg tooth. This is not true for all birds. There are some that don't have egg teeth. Megapode chicks, which is a group sometimes noted as called incubator birds, develop an egg tooth but then lose it before hatching.
Huh.
And kiwi chicks never develop an egg tooth, and that's because both of these groups kick their way out of their eggs.
Megapode does mean big feet.
Yep, and these birds, if you look up pictures, these are like, some of them are called pheasants. They're ground-dwelling birds, big legs. Kiwi, big legs. These are powerful legged birds. And yeah, they kick their way out of their egg like a cartoon character about to meet Foghorn Leghorn.
I was just going to say, I'm picturing the typical situation is the little cartoon of just a little beak pecking its way out.
Mhm.
But then this is the situation of an egg that grows legs. The
Yes.
two legs kick out of the egg and then it runs around.
After they hatch, chicks most of the time lose the egg tooth. It typically sheds off a few days later. Some keep it around longer. Petrels keep it around for like weeks. And marbled merlets can have theirs up to a month. And evidently, in some songbirds, it's not shed, it reabsorbs.
Oh, interesting. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That's like the opposite of what most of the megapodes are doing, which is
Yes.
growing it. Well, I assume they're also reabsorbing it, but that
Yeah.
you're not wasting all that calcium that you're now not using.
This, though, is not the only toothy feature of some beaks. Many birds have serrations along that tomia edge of the beak.
Yes. This is where we start getting into the things that if you go on the internet and you say birds don't have teeth, you will have a bunch of actually people in your comments, I speak from experience, telling you that you're wrong because of structures like these.
Exactly. A lot of birds, this is a very common structure to varying degrees, will have some sort of serration or texturing along that, what would be the cutting edge of the beak. The smallest serrations, which are very common, are called scopate tomia and occur in like 30 bird families. These are like brush like ridges along the edge, and their job is to increase friction for many of these birds to handle hard food sources. So, like snails or tough
Okay.
beetles, maybe nuts.
These are like the ridges in a nutcracker that help hold the nut in place so that it doesn't just go flying across the room.
Exactly. So that you're not just shooting beetles out of your mouth. Some hummingbirds have serrations on their beak, which they use to fight each other, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, you got dagger faces.
Some of them will also use these to steal the nectar by puncturing into flowers, just breaking all the rules.
That's awesome. Just the idea of you're like drinking. The hummingbird is literally drinking the other hummingbird's milkshake.
Someone draw that. In some fish-eating birds, like kingfishers and mergansers, you'll get these serrations for helping to hold on to fish. Geese have serrations to help them cut plant matter as they're grazing and eating grass and stuff. Flamingos and some ducks, this is the structure that makes up their filtering mechanism. Toucans have these crazy forward-facing serrations just because they can. Some predatory birds, like falcons and shrikes, have tooth-like, like almost fangish structures that'll be like a pair or couple of pair of tomial teeth. And in things like shrikes and kites and all of these other birds, these serrations are purely the keratin. The beak, the bony beak, is not toothed or serrated.
Right. Yeah, this is sort of similar to the ridges on a scale of
Yes,
a
exactly.
lizard or something. These are ridges along the keratin of the beak.
The falcon, there is a little bit of deformation in the jawbone.
That's cool.
They do have a little bit of a notch. Not a tooth, it's just the bone shape, but there is some more going on there.
The future is saber-toothed falcons.
Oh, please, please. I would be so happy. The kings of this, though, are the pelagornithids.
Mm-hmm.
Are the pelagornithids, the pseudo-toothed birds. This is a fossil group. They are around from the Paleocene to Pliocene, Pleistocene, and so like 50 million years, and are super cool birds. They are from a clade called the Odontopterygiformes. They include some of the biggest flying birds that ever existed. Majority of them had wingspans of like 3.5 to 4.5 meters. And the biggest ones were like 5 to 6 meter wingspans.
Yeah, we talked about these a bit in episode 37.5.
Yes. And they have the craziest, coolest looking faces of just about any bird you can imagine.
These are the best beaks.
It's so cool. Along that edge of their beak, they have bony, so the skull shape are these bony denticles. So not teeth, but the skull comes down into these tooth-like structures, and they're arranged in this alternating wave pattern of small to large tooth structures that interlock down the snout in like a crocodile smile and are just so cool looking.
Yeah, this is the bone itself has formed into these spikes that come off of the jaw, not unlike the spikes along the frill of a triceratops or other ceratopsian, or the flanges that come down on the chin of some saber-toothed cats. These are
Yeah.
bone projections that function as teeth.
These denticles, though, are quite structurally weak and show no sign of wear or deterioration. So it has been suspected, we don't have the structure, that it most likely also had a keratin sheath, a remphotheca, to cover these toothy structures that probably to some degree or in some way followed the shape.
Yes.
Whether or not it followed the shape precisely or added to the shape, that's hard to know. They noted that some of these smallest denticles could feasibly just be completely hidden within the thickness of a keratin covering, but probably some sort of toothy keratin. The shape of their beak, the hook at the end, the toothy structures all lean toward them being fish or squid eaters, and they're soaring birds, so likely hunting on the wing out on the ocean, potentially like albatross do, skimming and picking things out of the surface of the water. They also get attention because these are not teeth, but they do seem to be better potential tooth analogs, like closer matches to teeth than any of the other examples we've talked about, partially because when we do look at examples of teeth in birds, these seem to kind of match positioning and kind of be a similar pattern. They also noted that we do have one example of modern teeth in birds, which is in certain chickens, a mutation can happen on a Tauplid 2 mutation, a TA2, where in the chick embryo, tooth rudiments, so just the beginnings of teeth, will develop on the very front of the upper and lower beaks. This is not something that will develop into a chicken because it is a fatal mutation.
Right.
But we do get the kind of beginnings of teeth. They're very simple, cone-shaped. They lack any of the like dentine or enamel, the structures of teeth, but the tooth buds start. And some of the positioning does seem similar to these pseudo teeth. So it may be that there's a similar genetic pathway to the actual positioning where teeth might be and where these tooth structures might be, but there's still no direct support for that. Just potentially these could be more toothy than just bony structures.
Yeah. I like that we're seeing both ends of this. We talked about the parrotfish, which have teeth that have been modified into this shape so that they look and function like a beak. And now we have beaks that have been modified into a shape that they look and function like teeth.
Yep, it's the grass is always greener, isn't it? One other fun note on those toothed chicken embryos, the teeth that do start to form do surprisingly resemble early teeth in alligators and crocs and some other reptiles, and Archaeopteryx, the famous first bird that had teeth instead of a beak.
Yeah, modern birds have within their genetic and protein makeup remnants of reptilian teeth.
Exactly. And this is because birds used to have teeth. Most Mesozoic birds are toothed. Like
Yeah.
most birds you'd find during the Mesozoic had teeth.
This is one of my favorite things to point out and blow people's minds a little bit with, is that modern birds are by definition toothless. But modern birds are only one lineage among the birds. They're just the only one that made it into the Cenozoic. Before 66
Yes.
million years ago, more birds had teeth than not. Teeth were just a thing that birds
Yes.
had.
And you see a huge variety of tooth and beak structures among these birds. Many had teeth and a partial beak.
Yes. They had both, which again is an unusual situation.
Exactly. Two famous examples that will often get cited when this comes up, partially because they were some of our early examples, are Hesperornis and Ichthyornis, which are two closely related Cretaceous birds. Hesperornis is a large bird, like 1.5 to 2 meters long, and had basically no wings and was a swimming bird, often compared to cormorant kicking with the back feet. And they had teeth present along the entire lower jaw, but only in the back of the upper jaw, the front of the upper jaw, and the very tip of the lower had a beak.
Yes. The teeth end where the beak begins.
Yes, and the surface of their bone suggests that they did indeed have a rhamphotheca, a keratin covering to it. So not just toothless, but beaked. Ichthyornis also had a similar setup. This was a much smaller bird and would have at a glance just looked like a normal modern bird, except that they had toothy little mouths. And in fact, when they were first found, the body was recognized to be a small bird. The head was thought to be a marine reptile because it was not birdie. These are like pigeon sized and have often been considered maybe be like seabirds such as gulls and petrels and stuff. They also have teeth in the back and beak up front, but they have teeth in the middles of both jaws. So the middle section of each jaw has teeth, and then the tips of both are covered in a hooked beak. Their teeth are also noted to be slightly flattened and hooked backwards, which very satisfying.
Classic reptilian tooth setup.
Yep.
Or even more accurately, a classic theropod dinosaur tooth setup.
Yes. And I did see it noted that their lower jaw is very similar to other dinosaurs, non-bird dinosaurs, and their jaw musculature is also more similar to non-bird dinosaurs. But it does seem that they had mobile jaws like modern birds. So they were this mosaic of ancient and modern bird features. These both, though, are notable because they had weird teeth setup. Their teeth were not in sockets, their teeth were in grooves along the jaw, like mosasaurs.
Yeah, so they were, and this was, as far as I know, this wasn't the case for all ancient birds. I believe Archaeopteryx had teeth in sockets.
Yeah, it noted no other bird nor other dinosaur is this. This is unique to this group of birds.
Yes, Archosaur, crocs, and dinosaurs have thecodont teeth like us. Each tooth sits in a socket. And lizards tend to have the teeth on a shelf, like kind of just inside of the jaw itself, sitting on a little shelf in there. Teeth in grooves is an odd thing to do.
It's weird, really weird.
This is the cost of having teeth and beak.
Yes, you're not supposed to be doing this. It's they're hacking the game.
their jaw is glitched out, and so their teeth are flipping through the jaw.
This is a Bethesda bird.
This is bird evolution after you caught missing no, and now everything's gone a little bit haywire.
Another thing that was notable that is not common among other toothed birds is that the roof of their mouth had pits for the lower jaw teeth to fit into.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, that's super neat. Another note on their interesting note on ancestry, they had compound beaks, which is the ancestral form of bird beaks. And so they had that multi-part beak. And they have been very important, especially Ichthyornis, for our historical understanding of bird evolution, because this was the first toothed bird we ever found. This was the first time we went, birds used to have teeth? And yeah, here it was. So this was very critical for us starting to actually understand what birds used to be and how they became what they are now, which is a great segue, if I've ever heard one, to move in to the second part of our discussion, where we will discuss bird beak evolution and the trends to gaining a beak.
Beak evolution is a topic that has been studied extensively. This is a question that scientists have been interested in for many, many a decade, and we've been looking into it from the fossil side, from the genetic side, from the developmental side. There's a lot to say about how a bird beak grows and comes into place, what parts of the cells are making the beak, how it's interacting with the jaw. This is going to have to be a very brief touch on the very many things that have been said about beak evolution.
Yes, I'm sure we talked about some of this in episode 37 on the evolution of birds, because this is such an iconic feature of birds. Even in this more focused discussion, there's a lot to be said about beak evolution.
Well, and a lot of it gets into the real nitty-gritty of at which point, which stage of development the cell layer starts to interact with the layer that would maybe have become teeth, and how maybe that's interrupting, and what genetic information that, like, a bunch of things that I do not understand well enough to give a good synopsis of.
Yes, go check out the literature on bird beak evolution.
Yes.
We'll do the 101.
Absolutely. And there are other people's beaks to talk about and their evolution than just birds. So this is beaks, not just bird beaks. But to start off, bird beaks. As we mentioned already, we do know some things about, like, the ancestral beak. We know that it started out with that compound sheath instead of the solid one that most birds have today. We do have evidence, as we mentioned with Hesperornis and Ichthyornis, of, like, the partial beaked snout with teeth and beak and some sort of combination of the beak forming from the tip and slowly moving back. We have fossils that show patterns like that, but there are a bunch of questions about the details of beak evolution that are quite hard to parse out. One, the beak sheath does not fossilize usually. This is keratin. It is, falls under the umbrella of soft tissues. It's not going to fossilize except in rare occasions where we can get, like, biofilms from the, really nice flattened fossils that you get from, like, J-hole biota and stuff like that.
Yeah, for the most part, we have to rely on the bones themselves to understand what beaks we're doing.
Yes. And we can get hints from the bone whether a Rhamphotheca was present. Like, there's attachment site, there's, pattern to the bone that will show and suggest that some form of keratin sheath was present.
Yeah, but details of the shape of it and the size of it, things like that are much harder to determine.
Exactly. And that can be sometimes incredibly informative to the lifestyle of the bird or what kind of bird we might be looking at. Those tomial teeth that our modern birds have aren't going to show on the bone at all. That's all keratin. We also run into the issue that many fossilized birds are flattened. So the delicate skull features that might give us details as to how beaky their face were might be more or less destroyed. So they're very fragile animals. We rarely get a 3D preserved bird skull. So the specimens that we've been able to look at this in are not as wide as we might hope. So there's been lots of questions, and therefore lots of research trying to answer these questions. There are some general patterns that we can note with beak evolution. As mentioned, we have those partially beaked and partially toothed birds, and when we look at the pattern, we can see that the line leading to our modern birds, the beak started at the tip and slowly expanded backwards over evolution and progressively replaced the teeth until it was all there was.
Makes sense. If I was going to start a beak, that's how I would start it, from
Yes.
the business end.
And that's basically all the beaks that are discussed and that I saw referenced and that we know of are front of the mouth structures, at least.
Mm-hmm.
This relationship with it and toothlessness is also a pattern that is seen consistently, that the progression of beaks tends to increase toothlessness, the loss of teeth. I saw one paper describe it as beaks and teeth have an antagonistic coevolution.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of these led to full toothlessness. Some of it was just tooth reduction, but still retained teeth. When we do see tooth loss, though, it often seemed to be irreversible, that we do not see then a reduction in beak and regaining of teeth in any of the evolutionary lineages. This is a famous example of what's known as Dollo's law, which is a concept that says in evolution, when an organism evolves away from one form, it will almost never evolve back to that exact same form. Even if it comes back to something similar, it will be a different version of what it evolved from. And that in vertebrates, we've never seen a re-evolving of teeth from toothlessness. And one paper noted that there's only one example that even remotely hits it, which is a frog that re-evolved teeth on a toothless bone. Not full toothlessness. It had teeth on other bones, but it did re-evolve teeth on a bone that had lost teeth at one point. So that's also probably an important note on the evolution of beaks, that it seems when you evolve a beak, you might be kind of stuck with a beak, evolutionarily speaking. This is notable when we look at the genetics of modern birds. The genes for tooth development are still, the remnants are there, but they have built up mutations over time to where now they are just a shadow of the true genes they used to be. They are pseudo genes now. They've lost, for instance, all of the coding for the proteins of dentin and enamel. When we look at the timing of tooth loss and beak gaining, we do see some patterns. Full toothlessness in our modern bird lineage was reached between 125 to 65 million years ago. Now, whether it was reached once or multiple times is unclear. There's two main branches of our birds, the paleognaths and the neognaths. Paleognaths are your TMOs, your ostriches, and your ratites, and then the neognaths are the rest of birds. They diverged around 95 to 80 million years ago, give or take. There aren't any Cretaceous specimens of these two groups that have nice, complete jaws, at least by the time the paper I was looking at had noted. There might be something that's been found since then, but this makes it hard to know whether beaks evolved before that split and is ancestral to both groups, or if it developed separately in both groups. Either way, some amount of beakedness and tooth loss is likely ancestral to the whole group because we have evidence of tooth reduction in the group going back to 150 to 110 million years ago. And I saw one paper note that because there is evidence of tooth loss so early in the bird lineage, that it's likely that the genetic basis was something ancestral to the overall lineage. That's something they got from their non-bird dinosaur ancestors. But we also see different patterns of tooth loss. We see different arrangements of tooth loss, like where they're losing the teeth and how they're developing the beak. Because beaks did not develop one time, even without our confusion about our two modern lineages. Tooth reduction evolved in birds at least 6 independent times, 4 of which led to full toothlessness and a beaky face. So this was something birds were doing left, right, and center. And different groups did it in different ways very often.
Yeah, this is, we said earlier that surprising fun fact that birds during the Cretaceous period largely had teeth, but it's also true that birds during the Cretaceous period came in a variety of toothed and beaked genres. Like, how much tooth and how much beak wasn't a straight line from early birds to later birds. Different lineages tried out different things at different times. So throughout the Cretaceous, you could probably find at least one species at any percentage of the way between full teeth and full beak.
And another point, like important thing to emphasize here, because it's so easy. I even saw one paper calling them intermediate stages. It's very easy to look at these half tooth, half beak birds and be like, oh, you were 50% done. You only got 50% progress to full bird, but that's inaccurate. Many of these groups never reached full toothlessness, but stayed at their partial beak, partial toothed the entire time of their lineage. That's how they were a bird.
Well, and very much like you were talking about with Dicynodonts, which had some teeth, but then also had a beak in the front of the face, very much like the condition we see in some other dinosaurs. Having tooth and beak is a perfectly viable life strategy.
It is, as we always like to emphasize, that judging the fossil record off of what we have today will often lead you astray. The birds we have today are all fully beaked and toothless, but those are just the birds that survived the end Cretaceous extinction. It turns out we got toothless birds that survived that extinction. That was a happenstance situation. There's not any direct evidence that something about them being the toothless birds is why they necessarily survived. It might just be that that was the group that made it through for whatever reasons it was they survived, and it happened that they were fully toothless birds, and that's now all we've had for the last 65 million years.
Yeah, it's possible that their toothlessness was related to their survival. Probably not in the sense of like they didn't have teeth and that gave them the edge, but it very well might be that they didn't have teeth because of their diet, and their
Yes.
diet meant they lived in certain habitats that, for whatever reason, meant that they were more likely to survive. That it might not be that they're completely unrelated. They might have
Exactly.
not had teeth and survived for similar reasons, but
Mhm.
teeth or no teeth was probably not the deciding factor in whether or not birds survived the extinction.
And we'll talk a bit about like what are some of the pros and cons of going without teeth, but also wanted to look at some of the other ways birds were doing the tooth beak situation. We see in some enantiorniths, the opposite birds, the other major group of birds that was very big during the Cretaceous, that their toothlessness actually starts in the maxilla. So the back of the upper jaw and the back of the lower jaw as well, that their toothlessness started from the back, while our birds are famous for having losing their teeth from the front. So they were truly opposite even in that regard. The group that includes ichthyornis and hesperornids, as we mentioned, did lose their teeth from the front of the upper jaw, but they retained teeth on the lower jaw and weren't losing it in the same pattern on the lower jaw, while then birds leading to our group were losing them from the front pretty evenly. I saw one paper note that because we see such what they called modularity, that so many options of how to do this, is probably why we don't see a general trend across birds during the Mesozoic toward toothlessness. Only in the modern bird group do we see a general trend that way. The others were not all trending toward constantly losing more teeth. It seems that it was a actually very flexible toolkit and you could make it functional in many different ways. That being said, though, a big question that comes up with birds in general is why lose teeth to begin with? Why get rid of the teeth? What's the benefit? The age old classic explanation you will see, and that you will hear, and is by far the most common one shared around, is that it was adaptation to reduce weight for flying. That getting rid of the teeth and replacing it with a beak was cutting down on all those bony, knobbly bits and making them more air friendly and able to fly, have powered flight more easily.
Right. Which, at this point in the episode, should already sound very suspicious.
Exactly.
Because we know that tons of Cretaceous birds had teeth, bats have teeth,
Yes.
pterosaurs, many of them had teeth. Teeth are not the antithesis to flying.
Exactly. And we have fully toothless beaked animals that aren't anywhere near flying. Turtles are not getting ready to take to the air. So that can't be the benefit of a beak. There are definitely aspects of it is lighter than teeth. So there could be selective pressures that might have aided, but it is most likely not the pressure, especially when we also step back and remember that a bunch of other bird features that we always used to point at as, that's an adaptation for flight. Feathers, hollow bones, that super duper heart of theirs, that's all adaptations for flight, baby. And then we realized, nope, those are just dinosaur features that had
Yep.
other uses before flying was a thing. So this is widely considered a very anachronistic explanation that is at least misleading to say that is why they develop beaks. So, what are the other reasons? Why might an animal develop a beak? Probably the next biggest one that you'll come across is, as we've mentioned over and over, diet. A pretty consistent pattern we see in many groups, and we'll get to some of those other groups in just a bit, is that when we see the development of a beak, we also see a shift in diet from carnivory to omnivory or herbivory, meat eating to eating more than meat or eating plants. And that beaks seem to be very often associated with this shift in diet, at least in certain groups, which does make sense when you look at other examples of herbivorous animals. Many hooved herbivores have reduced their front teeth because if all I need to do is pull plant off of structure, I just need to clip the plant. I don't necessarily need super complex dentition. And a beak is a pair of shears, which is really good for just clipping plant material. and then passing it back to whatever structure you're going to process that plant with. But it is not the only potential benefit of a beak. It might have also had a developmental benefit. Teeth are a quite complex structure to grow. And when looking at dinosaur incubation periods that have toothy mouths, they noted that many of them did have slower development rates than we see in birds and more beaked relatives, and that reducing teeth might have had a benefit of speeding up development time inside the egg and speeding up the growth of young. So it might have been an adaptation that helps with hatching quickly and getting out of the egg faster. Another benefit that comes from a beak is that it often shows that it strengthens the jaw.
Yeah, you've got this extra coating, that this shield that surrounds the bones.
And that in many situations, when they did biomechanical studies, they saw that it reduced twisting and torsion forces on the jaw and gave a sturdier snout. And it's worth noting that many studies have found that when you look at beaks and compare them to teeth, they are at least as efficient at food acquisition. So it doesn't seem like you actually lose any effectiveness, any productivity by switching over. Now, which one of these was the main reason could be for a different answer for different groups. They probably all interacted that if it strengthens my jaw and the younger hatching a bit earlier, and it's good for the plants that we're starting to eat more of, then you have multiple selection pressures. But there are more than just lightening the skull or eating something new. There's a bunch of different things that beaks are actually quite helpful for an animal to survive. And then another thing to note that probably is one of the reasons birds became such kings of the beak, and we mentioned this earlier, is the gizzard, that they have this structure that allows them to process food in a similar way as if they had teeth still and take on a wide variety of foods. We have evidence that a muscular gizzard goes back to the early members of birds. Sapiornis, which is one of the first birds where that tooth reduction is noted in, one of the earliest, has evidence of a gizzard, mainly through gastroliths, the little stones that would be in the gizzard. We also have evidence of this from other non-bird theropod dinosaurs, the two-legged dinosaurs they evolved from. So gizzards were probably a feature of the ancestors of birds. If not, were a very commonly evolved structure among this group, and is likely part of the reason why having a beak was such a popular thing to do among this group of dinosaurs.
I would imagine that the gizzard certainly helps with full toothlessness.
Exactly.
Because this is, when we think about mammals, and we were talking about the dicynodonts earlier, that they've got that beak right up at the front, which for mammals, losing teeth is an even weirder thing to do because mammal teeth are so specialized with different tasks. Front teeth for snipping, back teeth for grinding. Sometimes we've got big canines for showing off and stuff. If you have a snipping beak, then you don't really need those front teeth necessarily. You can snip the food and then move it back to your grinding teeth in the back. But if you are completely losing teeth, you don't have a way to grind food. So your options tend to either be don't grind food, like eat stuff that you don't have to grind, or come up with another way to do it. And birds have come up with another way to do it using the gizzard. That means they can still eat food that needs to be ground.
Yes. And to emphasize that a gizzard can still be useful even sans beak. Crocs have a gizzard-like structure. They have a muscular portion of their stomach that has gastroliths in it and helps with food processing. And even though they are extremely toothed, they eat in a similar way to birds in that they cannot chew. Birds and crocs do not have chewing ability.
Croc teeth are used the same way as most bird beaks, which is to grab and maybe cut, right? Maybe snip. In the case of crocs, they're snipping like the leg off of something.
Yeah.
And then swallow it. But yeah, they're not processing in the mouth.
And this actually came up in the Discord just the other day of someone asked, because we were talking about tooth loss in animals, like old animals, and is there any animal that can survive with full tooth lossage? And I went, yeah, crocs, because if you're old enough to lose your teeth as a croc, you're the biggest croc in the lake. And at that size, you don't need teeth to be deadly, and you can just bully people away. But they can also still eat just like they would have, because as long as I can swallow it, the stomach will handle it for me, because I've got a gizzard and a bunch of rocks and acid.
Yep.
Speaking of other cousins of birds, we've been mentioning over and over that birds are not the only dinosaur that develop beaks. Birds famously are theropod dinosaurs, the two-legged, mostly predatory group. There are a bunch of other beak examples in dinosaurs. Basically, every major group of dinosaurs you can think of has some beaked member in it. It's super common.
Yeah, once again, as is so often the case, features that we think of as being bird features are often dinosaur features. Dinosaurs were really good at evolving beaks. Beaks showed up over and over and over again in dinosaurs.
We see all different patterns. It evolved many individual times. Theropods had beaks. Sauropods had beaks. The ornithischians, so the horned dinosaurs, and your hadrosaur dinosaurs had beaks. We have beaked members across Dinosauria. This is often noted by a toothless section of the mouth and the texture of the bone, like we mentioned earlier. We also see very different patterns of beakedness, many which had just a beak at the very front of the snout, but then teeth behind it. Some which had very small, like just lip beaks. Like it was just the edge of the snout. And then others that had big, honkin', parrot-like beaks. There are fully toothless, fully beaked dinosaurs that are not birds, and some of which are not even that close to the ancestors of birds. And in most of these cases, we also see that shift to herbivory, that this is a plant-eating dinosaur feature. The beak is good for snipping plants and shifting toward a plant-based diet.
Yeah, it's something that's harder to see when you're just thinking about like triceratops and hadrosaurs and stuff. But when you look at theropod dinosaurs, over and over again, you have this shift from carnivory to herbivory. We talked about this in episode 173, and many of those times, you also see the development of a beak.
Yes, it's very common. There's at least 6 different times we've seen it in theropod evolution. And I did see one paper that noted that as you get closer related to birds, it becomes more common.
Yeah, because your oviraptorosaurs got
Yep.
beaks and your ornithomimosaurs got beaks.
The maniraptoriforms, which is this group of dinosaurs and birds, seem to be really good at developing beaks, which could suggest that there's some shared genetic trait that lends them toward developing this feature. You know, whether their face is especially good to keratinize or their teeth are especially easy to lose. But there does seem to be some shared feature in this group that they developed beaks quite often. As mentioned, though, the other groups of dinosaurs also many had beaks. In some of them, you see situations where certain individuals, certain species would have beaks, like sauropods are one of those where not all sauropods were beaked, but we have examples of what seem like very likely beaked sauropods, which is also cool to think that that's probably one of the biggest beaks that's ever been on the planet just because of the size of the animal.
Yeah, by definition, until we get truly beaked whales.
Yes, exactly. I think hadrosaurs also fall into that category where it's not every single member that has a beak. Ceratopsians, though, are a beaked group. They are all beaked, or at least to my knowledge, maybe there's a ceratopsian out there that's the beakless one.
Yeah, but they were at least mostly beaked. This is your horned, frilled dinosaurs. Episode 87. This is, when we talk about beaked dinosaurs, this is the first example that comes to mind, for me, is ceratopsians.
Exactly. They were prominently beaked. They had large, prominent beaks up front, though I don't think there's a case of one of them going toothless and beaked. I don't think we have any toothless beaked ceratopsians. They all had a beak up front and then that tooth battery in the back for grinding stuff up.
Yeah, they kind of did best of both worlds, where they have the beak, but then they have some of the most specialized grinding teeth.
And so this is one of those great examples of, yes, beaklessness and toothlessness or tooth reduction go hand in hand. That if you develop a beak on the front of your snout, most likely you're going to have to get rid of those teeth on the front of the snout. But that doesn't mean you are on your way to losing all your teeth. This is a extremely successful global group of dinosaurs, arguably one of the most successful groups of dinosaurs. And they did beak and teeth the whole time.
Yes. Once again, this is one of those cases where if you're only looking at the living species, you might get the
Yes.
wrong idea. That in order to be a beaked animal, you have to be toothless and you either have to fly or live in the water.
Yeah, exactly. When I could see someone asking the question of why didn't ceratopsians ever lose why didn't they ever get a full beak? And that question's a little bit flawed, because why
Yes.
would they? Because you don't need to.
Well, and also, ceratopsians had a great setup in the back of the mouth
Oh, yeah.
that was really beneficial to keep around. Whereas
Yes.
early birds, even birds that hadn't fully lost their teeth, the teeth that they did have were relatively simple
Yes.
and relatively unspecialized teeth.
Yeah. Theropod teeth are much more akin to crocodile teeth than they are to mammal teeth, while ceratopsians were going a much more mammal route in the way they grew teeth.
Yeah, ceratopsians and hadrosaurs. Episode 176 for hadrosaurs. Both did, in some, beaks up front, and then those just colossal dental batteries of teeth.
One very cool thing about all these beaked herbivores is that there have been studies to look into, can we get any information of what kind of herbivore you were from your beak shape? And we do tend to see some patterns in snout and beak morphology across these groups. When it comes to ceratopsians, I found one paper noting that we can see a shift in the kind of jaws they had as you go from early members to later members. Early members being things like Protoceratops and Psittacosaurus that had a frill but no horns, were smaller. Some were bipedal, walking on two legs. And they have beaks, but they're not as big. They're smaller, and the jaw is less rigid. It shows a bit more flexibility. And then the later groups, your big like Centrosaurines and Chasmosaurines, the big horned ceratopsians, have rigid jaws and big, powerful beaks. But even between those two groups, there is a noted pattern where Centrosaurines have deeper skulls for stronger bites, and the Chasmosaurines have less tall skulls for weaker bites or less strong bites. Would still wouldn't want to be bitten by one. And that we do see patterns in groups across a lot of herbivorous dinosaurs that could suggest niche partitioning, where you have different herbivores eating in slightly different ways and eating slightly different foods so they can share a habitat. I found one really cool study that looked at Laramidia, which is in the late Cretaceous portion of North America that was created by the Western Interior Seaway. This was a small area. It's not a very big landmass, estimated to be around 4 to 7 million square kilometers, but had a wide variety of dinosaurs, and in this case, particularly herbivorous dinosaurs, large herbivores, mega herbivores that were diverse, that were populous, and it's brought up question of, yeah, but how? How were you all living on such a small landmass? And two explanations have been given. Either this was a really productive landmass, it just had enough food for all of them, or they were niche partitioning, each eating a different food source so they weren't competing as often. And to look into that, they've looked at the snout and beak shapes to see if we see evidence for that, and we seem to. When we look at the groups, there's ankylosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, there's ceratopsians, and then there's nodosaurs, the non-clubbed-tailed armored dinosaurs, and hadrosaurs, your duck-billed, quote-unquote. The ankylosaurs have wide, square beaks, which looks like it is adapted for bulk feeding, taking in a lot of food and generalized, so maybe going after things that are nutritionally poor, like grasses or something, that they can just mow and vacuum up. Ceratopsians have relatively narrower but still squarer beaks, and are likely more selective feeders, going after more nutritional parts of plants. More similar to black rhinos, where the ankylosaur is probably more similar to white rhinos with their different snout shapes. And then both the nodosaurs and the hadrosaurs had intermediate snout shapes, likely going for a mixture and just more generalist, taking a little bit of the bulk, but a little bit of the specific. What's interesting is when they looked at this, they found those differences among these big groups, but within families, there didn't seem to be niche partitioning. So it seemed like there was more consistency within the families of dinosaurs. But it does look like there was a herbivore regime of different feeding types. I also like that they noted that in modern ecosystems, we often group our herbivores between browsers and grazers, whether you're eating leaves or grasses.
Mm-hmm.
But considering that at this time grasses would have been relatively rare, that the probably better groups to put them into is bulk feeders, concentrate feeders like the ceratopsians, picking out the best things, and then intermediate feeders.
Yeah, bulk feeders, which are going to probably be specializing on lower quality foods.
Yes.
Right, plants that are less nutritious, but it doesn't matter because you're just going to suck up as much as you can. And then those narrow snouts, like you said, we see this in some herbivores today.
Yeah.
Narrow snouts are often associated with more selective feeding. You are grabbing just the best plants.
Yeah, I'm grabbing the flower or the bulb or the piece that's good. And then you get things, they compare it to when you look at water buffalo, which have wide snouts and are just eating a ton of stuff, and then antelope, which are nibbling and picking off the best bits. Which I loved this study. It's very cool to be reminded that dinosaurs had beaks, but they were also doing beaks in very different ways. You have a lot of different beaks across dinosaurs.
And a lot of them were doing beaks in ways that birds don't do and that turtles don't do. So they were using beak, and this brings us back to sort of what we were talking about at the top of this discussion. Beak is very much a catch-all term for a structure that can come in so many different shapes and forms and functions. There's a lot you can do with a beak.
Yes, absolutely. And then the final group to mention is pterosaurs. Arguably the most similar to birds in many ways. And there are pterosaurs that show evidence were also, at least some of them, beaked. These are the flying reptiles of the Mesozoic, the first flying vertebrates before birds did it. They did it before it was cool. In the beak regards, there are a lot of parallels in pterosaur and bird evolution. We see lots of examples of tooth reduction in pterosaurs, just like we see in birds. And also similarly, different patterns, like different amounts of tooth loss at different portions of the jaw, tooth retention, keeping teeth and making them prominent in different ways. There are pterosaurs that have full mouths of teeth, which is very toothy mouths. We see ones that have lost teeth at the back of the mouth, but have prominent and even enlarged teeth at the front of the snout. We see teeth at the back of the snout, and then toothlessness at the front, and some fully toothless pterosaurs. So we have basically almost all the exact same patterns that we see in birds among pterosaurs. And some of these toothless ones, and that had either toothless tips of the snout or fully toothless snouts, there's often evidence of some form of keratin covering. It seems they had a beak, what we would define as a beak. Many of the ones that are missing teeth at just the very tip, there is evidence for a keratin hook that just the very tip of the snout lacked teeth, and it had a hooked portion of keratin. And this is a very recent discovery that's been noted with UV light analysis to detect the presence of this keratin hook in the preserved sediment. There are many pterosaurs that it is unclear whether they had any keratin covering. So they may have had some other just toothless structure that was not keratin covered. It's also hard to know if they did have it. Was it one of these hooks? I saw it noted that the toothless tips on things like Rhamphorhynchus could be an indicator for this kind of hooked tip of a beak. But it does seem that some of the groups that had these keratin hooks that's what then expanded and progressed into a further, more complete beak. And we see the similar pattern of it expanding backwards and slowly replacing teeth in certain lineages. Similar things have been asked as to why they would evolve this, and the similar answers to the birds of weight loss is suggested. This one, notably, though, makes even less sense in pterosaurs because of their anatomical differences to birds. That the main weight of the skulls is likely caused for pterosaurs by larger muscles than we see in birds. So it doesn't seem like the weight loss that you would get from getting rid of teeth would be as notable in pterosaurs. So even if this is a driver, it would probably be a even less important selection for them than it would be for birds if it is a benefit. But also, it seems to have a strengthening feature, making the snout more resilient. And then with pterosaurs, may explain why we see such extremely elongated snouts in so many pterosaur groups. It's been hypothesized by some that those snouts may not be physically possible without a keratin sheath reinforcing and strengthening such a long, slender snout.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Mm-hmm. So when you get things, like Pteranodon and Asdarchids that just have these swords of a face, it may be that they were able to do that because they had this keratin reinforcement. It also might be helpful because keratin has different densities than bone and can act as basically a force absorber when biting. It can absorb forces differently than bone does, and there have been biomechanical studies that when they've measured what the potential force resistances of different pterosaur skulls are when they bite something, what force they can take, the toothless skulls often had much higher measurements than toothed skulls. And it could be that, this keratin allowed for that extreme mechanics to be a thing in those toothless pterosaurs. This has led to other questions of what features might this keratin have had. Our modern birds, we have lots of examples of how they've adapted the keratin to aid in their feeding and lifestyles. It is expected that we could see similar things of like the tomial toothed serrations or those bristle-like structures that increase the friction to be able to grab and hold stuff. We can't know whether or not any pterosaurs had those features since the keratin is not preserving. We do see some features of the beak that do seem to indicate increasing the grippage of the beak. Things like reliefs on the interior of the beak that would give more gripping surface. But as far as we currently know of pterosaurs, we haven't seen any that have those bony pseudo-teeth, like the pelagornithids, those pseudo-toothed birds. We don't have any evidence of beak serrations or beak, pseudo-teeth in pterosaurs. Doesn't mean they didn't have them, but we don't have any direct evidence as of yet. And then to wrap us up, I just had some cool beaked pterosaurs, since that's what this is all about. There are some pterosaurs with neat, weird beaks. Sungaripterids were a group of pterosaurs that had a sharp, toothless tip of the beak, but then what seemed to be crushing teeth in the back, and have been interpreted as going after hard food sources, shellfish or something similar to that, durophagous feeders, and likely using that tip of the beak to either like get into nuts or pry shellfish or something off of rocks. That's the tool to get to the hard food and then crush it up with those teeth behind the beak. There have also been a couple of different pterosaurs with particularly long beaks that have notable pitting holes along the bone of the beak that look like they are for nerve endings. That might be for probe hunting, sensing prey by touch. And we see this in birds today, like the kiwi and like certain fishing birds that will either hunt at night or are hunting in an environment where they can't see where the prey is and are feeling for their prey. And it looks like there were some pterosaurs doing that. Loncodraco and Leptostomia are two pterosaurs that have what seem to be sensitive beaks. There's also Synopterus, which is a species of pterosaur that has a kind of a bit more parrot shape, like not as short as a parrot, but that more hooked, curved, tall beak. And specimens have been found with minerals in the stomach cavity that seemed to pertain to them eating plants, and that they were herbivorous, much like parrots are, and potentially snipping at plants with their beaks. And then the last note I had, which isn't actually about the beak, but is another parallel to our famous beaked birds, Cunpingopterus is a pterosaur where 2 individuals have been found with what seem to be pellets outside of the body that are regurgitants, similar to what we see in like owls and some other predatory birds, of bits of food they have regurgitated, which suggests they had something similar to a gizzard somewhere to hold this to then regurgitate it, and could mean that they were also functioning with a 2-part stomach like we see in birds and other dinosaurs and other beaked animals.
Yeah. The fact that birds have beaks, dinosaurs evolved beaks a whole bunch of different times. Pterosaurs had beak-like structures, and we've also got turtles who these days, more recent studies suggest that they are aligned with archosaurs. Does all make me wonder why we haven't gotten beaked crocs.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually.
It seems like they're in the right part of the reptile family tree to develop into beaked creatures.
I would have to look into like things like atosaurs, which I believe do have toothless tips of the snout.
Oh, you might be right.
I think their snout tips are toothless. I can't remember if I've ever heard them interpreted as maybe having beaks, but I think that would be our main thing, is that it's a feature that goes with herbivory, and we have multiple examples of herbivorous crocs in Earth's history, but they would probably be the only ones we would likely see beaks in. When we think of things like predatory beaks in predatory birds, those are secondary adaptations to a beak that came from some likely herbivorous ancestor. So yeah, I that's a very good point, though. Huh. Well, on that head scratcher, we can round up our discussion. That is all I currently have to say about beaks. There's lots more to say, so if you want to hear more, ask me again another time, and maybe we can talk about beaks in some other context. But I hope you all enjoyed our investigation into beaks. It is, like we said, very similar to horns and very similar to even like tails and stuff. A famous, and we all know what we mean when we say it, but yet when you look closer, a lot more going on behind the beak. Before we end the episode, we have one last section, which is our patron question. If you sign up on Patreon at certain levels, you can submit questions to us that we will answer at the end of our episodes. What's our question for this episode, David?
This episode's patron question comes from Supernova, who says, the Owls episode, that was episode 186, we talked about owl pellets and mentioned that other birds create pellets too. What about ancestral groups to birds? For example, did any theropod dinosaurs create pellets?
An excellent question, and yes, they did.
They sure did.
We have evidence of pellets from non-bird theropods. We have evidence of gizzards, which is that muscular portion that, as we went over in more detail in the owls episode, is the part that collects and compresses the pellet into that regurgitatable little pill. But we do have direct evidence of pellets in fossil dinosaurs. We have it from other birds, but we do have evidence from a troodontid known as Anchiornis, which dates to about 160 million years old. And we have 6 gastric pellets, vomited up pellets, that show light acid-etched lizard bones and fish scales. And some of them are associated with Anchiornis skeletons, and at least some were even situated in the throat. This is the earliest theropod we know of that produced pellets, so it seems likely that this was a thing among theropods. If early members had it, and we have later members that had it, it likely was something that was shared by many in the group.
Yeah, Anchiornis has gone back and forth over time. These days, I think it is typically considered a troodontid, which are very close to the bird lineage. So it does seem to suggest that at least the dinosaurs near birds were producing gastric pellets. As farther back than that, like did Spinosaurus produce pellets, or even T-Rex? That we don't know. But as you pointed out, there are also pterosaurs that seem to have done it. So it's
Exactly.
very possible that this is either something very ancestral to dinosaurs, or it could be something that developed multiple times.
And we do see it in, like, crocs can also do it. They're not as famous because they can usually just digest bone, but they
Mhm.
can vomit up parts that are giving them trouble in a pseudo pellet. And I did see it noted in this paper that we do have things like tyrannosaur droppings that are full of bone chunks, which suggests that if they were producing pellets, bones weren't enough to make them do it. So
Right.
they at least weren't vomiting up bone the way a lot of other pellet producers do. But yeah, excellent question. Pellets were a more common, once again, another bird trait that was just a dinosaur thing. That was just their ancestors were doing this, and now birds also still do this.
Yes, thank you for that question. Thank you to all of our patrons. Hey, if you're a patron, you at certain levels you can submit questions for us to answer on the podcast. So do that.
Absolutely. You can find links down in the description and on our website. If you want more info, you can also check out the blog posts for this episode to get lots of links and pictures. You can also, don't forget to keep an ear out for spooky coming up. It's almost
Ooh.
that time of the year. We're also getting closer and closer to our next museum meetup. So we'll be seeing people in Atlanta at the Fern Bank coming up soon. Thank you to everyone who requested this episode. Thank you to all of our new patrons. Extra special thanks to our top tier patrons, Sarah May, Danielle the Bug Lover, Jeff Ellington, and Bogdraw.
Thank you all very, very much.
And we released episodes every fortnight.
Everyone.
And that's about it.
Beaks, beakity beak, beakity beak, beaks.
Play the Beak outro music.
Beacon.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.